the settings. A note to myself, I've got 25 years within the FM industry, and I focus on the corporate and B&I marketplace. So that's me. So over the past couple of days and weeks, we have seen an eruption of dialogue around, is this the death of the office? And it was just really, I wanted to put a slide in there around this because we have been debating this within the FM industry for over a decade now in terms of what does the office look like in the future. And there's a general consensus that it needs to look safe, it needs to look nurturing, it needs to embody the culture and ethos of the organisation, and it needs to focus on face-to-face connectivity, as opposed to desk-based and task-based working, which can obviously happen potentially remotely. So workplaces need to shift from being a space that you go to routinely to work to spaces that you desire to go to and that you're doing something creative and with a human connectivity element within it. So we can then, knowing that this agenda has been on the table for over a decade, we can talk about whether Covid-19 is a disruptor or a catalyst. And this slide really just goes to illustrate some of the trends that we were seeing that have been disrupted. And we'll talk further about how some of the trends Covid-19 has been a catalyst for. So you can see there that there was a trend towards densification of people into real estate, and we can see some trends that are certainly going to stop. So the central corporate mothership HQ, we think, is going to move towards smaller satellite regional offices model. Agile office working is going to move towards more fixed static working, and certainly the old offices where face-to-face connectivity was paramount has now been superseded by virtual connectivity. Lots of organisations coming out in terms of how far they're embracing this, the new ways of working. So we're seeing organisations like Twitter and Shopify come out and basically say, we're embracing this, this is not going to go away, and if people want to work from home, then we're going to enable it, and we'll enable it forever. Fundamentally, there needs to be a conversation very early on around who can be enabled to work from home. So therefore, what does the building need to accommodate in terms of occupation levels and densities? And is that viable given the 2-metre social distancing rule? So that traction between how many people need to come to site in order to do their job versus how many people can this building accommodate given the 2-metre social distancing rule. That conversation needs to happen very early on because one may inform the other in terms of what your reoccupation plan looks like. So this slide really just gives you a structure of how your reoccupation plan can come to fruition and get landed, and just gives you an understanding of the traction between what the core business needs to do or wants to do, and on the other side, what is feasible within your built asset, and that dialogue that needs to happen in order to develop a plan that is robust and that you can then deliver for reoccupation. And I think in lots of organisations, they're finding that there are lots and lots of iterations before they actually land a final plan. What an organisation, or how many people an organisation needs to get back into a building, is not necessarily how many people a building can safely now accommodate. So those dialogues are happening across organisations currently, and they are leading to amazing and creative solutions. So this is fundamentally all about your people. The built asset element, the FM element of it, is actually relatively simple. The piece of the puzzle that's more complicated and requires lots and lots of planning is the human element. So we do a lot of building reoccupations, we do a lot of transformation management within the built environment, and it is always the human behaviour element that requires most attention and most support. It is critical that you understand your people's motivations for coming back to work. And then you need to deliver against those expectations. The huge challenge and the gap that we all have here is that the primary motivator for returning to work is seeing people in human connectivity. And to a certain extent, sort of the routineness of going to work. And unfortunately, that is the one thing that we are all going to find it challenging to deliver against. So what we need to do is understand what the expectation is and then develop a plan that delivers it as far as you can do. So I talk in this slide about humanising the return to work and declinicalising it, that's not a word, de-sanitising it, in terms of how people transition back into the office. They want human contact, then you need to be able to deliver it to a certain extent. And that is the challenge that we all face with the 2-metre ruling and the ingrained nature of some of the behaviours that people have at work. Unravelling all of that and then piecing it back together again and still hitting the mark is a challenge. So now we're going to move on to the main part of the presentation, which are the FM considerations of reoccupation. I will caveat this with directing everybody to the government website. As everybody, I am sure, is aware, advice and recommendations and information is changing on a weekly, if not daily, basis. So I'm sure as soon as you've heard this presentation, everything will have changed again. So please always revert back to the guidance from the government and from the HSE. The other point to make is that FM is a melting pot, so we've covered what we see are the core disciplines within FM. It may be different within your organisation. Some of the debates may be different because your core business is slightly different to the one we're talking to within this presentation. So we aim this mainly at a corporate office for a large multinational. So the first thing to do is to undertake a risk assessment. So we've developed the reoccupation plan, we know what we've got to do, and now we're going to effectively risk assess that in reality, not hypothetically to develop the plan, but actually take it into reality. And that risk assessment will determine all the actions that you need to take. And so it's really, really important that it's robust, that it is a cross-functional risk assessment, and that it engages both HR, health and safety, and FM, and probably IT as well. And there are lots of points here. I'm not going to go through them all, but they're just to engage people in debate around things that may have to change or things that you may want to consider when you're having a dialogue internally within your own organisation. Things like, can we actually constrain the opening times because we've maximised remote working so we can reduce our overheads? Or do we need to extend the time because actually we need to get people back to work, so therefore we need to go to a 24-hour shift working pattern? Thinking about outsourced contracts, do we need to re-engage those? Do we need to re-specify them? Do we need to terminate some of them? So all those kind of really top-level decisions we've grouped within this slide. And lots of really small things as well, like installing dishwashers, implementing touch-free proximity-based devices around your building, implementing touch-free bins and things like that. So lots of sort of almost the minutiae of your considerations up to some really quite strategic decisions are within this slide. One really important thing to point out though is the government advice to enable staff to work from home unless they cannot. So that sort of initial assessment of what does our plan look like and what do we need to consider, fundamentally this is one of the key bits of information that we need to determine as an organisation, because that effectively will drive what the plan looks like and therefore what the risk assessment looks like. And also the need to fix teams to reduce cross-contamination between teams and to minimise the amount of people that people are coming into contact with when they come to work. So it's a big melting pot, and it moves from the minutiae into the strategic, but it's just the top considerations that we decided to present within this slide. So space planning is a key consideration in your safe reoccupation planning. Everybody needs to look at the volume of people that they need to get on site at any one time and look at all the key points within the building when they won't be able to manage the 2-metre social distancing rule. That is a huge amount of work for a lot of people, and different organisations are adopting it in different ways. There's lots of government guidelines on best practice and what they're suggesting, but fundamentally it does, at its very basic level, require organisations to stop agile working where at all possible, to allocate desks on a one-to-one basis, to work back-to-back or side-to-side where at all possible, to screen between desks where you can't accommodate the 2-metre social distancing rule. And there's lots of advice and guidance there in terms of this slide, just giving you ideas about what to do and how you can do it. Lifts, for instance, is a key issue, and stairwells where you can't actually pass somebody with a safe 2-metre distance, so therefore you need to mark up stairwells and down stairwells, and then you need to, within lifts, make sure that people are standing back to back, not facing each other. So again, lots of signage, lots of floor markings, and lots of planning and then reinforcing new behaviours. And what we talk about here is creating zones within buildings and fixing teams to zones. Again, to come back to that, how do you reduce the frequency of cross-contamination risk? Reception and security are generally going to be outside of your controlled zone, so it is important that you look at the risks and you mitigate that risks. I know some organisations where they're actually banning all visitors to site, and other organisations are actually having allocated slot times for visitors that employees can then book their visitors against to control the amount of visitors on site. But fundamentally, whatever the top line strategy is in terms of reception and security, you need to look at what functions they're going to be undertaking, and then how do you mitigate the risk around those functions being undertaken given the circumstances of what you're asking them to do. So there's lots of advice there. With security, there's a real role for them there in terms of reinforcing the new behaviours and monitoring their application within the work place. Within reception, really for them it's about reducing the amount of visitors, reducing the movement of those visitors throughout the building. We would recommend maybe creating visitor meeting rooms outside of the controlled zone, so you don't actually take the visitor into your controlled zone, and then ensuring that there's no cross-contamination risk. So old style visitor passes, old style visitor books, where you're giving the person a pen, where you're asking them to write their name, where you're then handing them a visitor pass, all that effectively needs to come to a halt, and you need to rethink and rework those procedures. So for anybody like me that feels they've been on a Zoom meeting for the last month or so, knows that meeting facilities is a key consideration in returning to the workplace, and certainly face-to-face meetings are one of the key drivers for people who want to go back to work. So it does need careful consideration. The 2-metre rule applies, so we're recommending that you take meetings out of the meeting rooms where at all possible. Potentially you could have stand-up meetings in open plan areas with the 2-metre rule still being adhered to. You could have them outside where the risk decreases, so we understand. But either way, wherever you land your meeting facility debate, you need to make sure that when people, and if people do come together face-to-face in meetings, that they are safe, that you reduce the risk of cross-contamination, and that you ensure that between meetings you are deep cleaning the space so that you're not contaminating the next meeting that comes in. Again, apply the fixed team protocols to meetings, so you don't want to have representatives from across the organisation coming into the same meeting room where you could potentially cross-contaminate the entire organisation. So you are looking to manage infection control, manage that risk of cross-contamination through the protocols and procedures that you're going to overlay on top. So cleaning and housekeeping, lots of really practical solutions here and suggestions to inform your debate. We are recommending increasing the input hours. Lots of organisations have decreased their spend on cleaning to the point at which it really is optimised to within an inch of its life. So we do need to consider increasing the input hours and cleaning frequencies, and that obviously will have a impact on your costs. You need to review cleaning to encourage trust amongst your employees. So we recommend that you move it from a discrete clean into daytime cleaning so people can see the cleaning being taken place. Then they start to build up trust in their working environment, and then feel far more comfortable, and therefore hopefully productivity increases as their anxiety decreases. Lots of suggestions. I'm not going to go through all of them, but we would advise implementing colour coding, and potentially colour coding so you've got no cross-contamination between zones. So where you've zoned open plan areas, then you colour code within those zones so that you're not moving products and materials from one zone to the next. We'd recommend deep cleaning all workstations between one person using them and the next person using them. So therefore, if you have got any remnants of agile working, you need to have a process in place where when somebody vacates a desk and another person comes into that desk, that the desk is completely deep cleaned. And to this end, we would be looking at things like adherence to very, very strict clear desk policies. Focus all your energy on critical control points, so handrails, door handles, so anything that you haven't been able to automate basically, and people are touching on a regular basis, and you can't remove that risk of that cross-contamination, then you're looking at overlaying a routine deep cleaning schedule to mitigate the risk. And then really we need to have, or the organisation needs to have a conversation around your deep cleaning protocols and your barrier cleaning protocols. So where somebody has developed symptoms of COVID in a working environment, what are you going to do to effectively and hygienically clean that environment so that it's safe for the next person to occupy? So when we talk about Covid-19 disruptor or catalyst, I think this is certainly one area where it has been a disruptor. For years, we've been taking away under desk bins and sending people to recycling hubs and encouraging people to segregate their waste into numerous bins, surrounded by their colleagues who are also throwing away their rubbish. Effectively, we need to turn back the time here. So what we're suggesting is the reintroduction of local waste bins to desks so that people don't have to move, and the introduction of bin liners as well, so that waste can be secured, so that any contaminated waste can be safely secured within a bin liner at the end of each day and then disposed of safely. Where there has been an incident, there is a recommendation out there that you double bag any waste, and we also need to understand what the virus longevity is on various surfaces to understand what waste storage protocols there may be around that. So again, just stay mindful of all the government advice and all the new learnings that the scientists have around this virus. Just really need to stay on top of that so that it informs our procedures, which then need to be adapted based on the advice. So I've talked about FM being a melting pot, and office services really is a catch-all for those facilities that you may find are actually managed by various parts of an organisation. But again, the elements represented here do represent some of the key areas that organisations need to consider to manage the risk of infection within the workplace. So thinking about MFDs and printers and copiers and central hubs that people have within the modern office, procedures need to be overlaid around that so that employees aren't put at risk. Some of the ideas that we've been working on are providing wipe down facilities, safe wipe down facilities for MFD, so that you can wipe down a surface before you then touch it, reducing the amount of printer, turning them off completely, and not allowing people to print or to copy if that's feasible within your organisation. Within the mailroom, there are some good ideas around halting distribution of hard copy items completely, scanning within the mailroom. Remember, the mailroom will be outside of your controlled zone. And just reviewing working practices, so the mailroom, who are very often quite squished into small spaces, are able to keep to the 2 metre social distancing, and also thinking about ventilation, are able to ventilate their working areas sufficiently. And where people are working outside of controlled zones, then there is a requirement to provide hand washing facilities, and where those aren't available, to provide hand sanitisation facilities. Some quick wins in there as well. So stop all non-business deliveries into the office. So people within organisations have become quite prolific about having their Amazon orders delivered to the office, and during this heightened risk, then really quick wins are things like stopping that within an organisation. Also suggesting that you look at cleaning items coming into an office, unpacking them within the mailroom, so you're just taking the item within the packaging, and lots of other suggestions that organisations come up with, like even serviced copying and printing facilities. So again, back to the good old days of the 80s and 90s, and potentially having a serviced printing hub where people can email their work to a central point who can then print it down, and who can then provide that service and provide that printing back to the employee. Catering is a tricky one because it is very difficult to sustain catering provision with socially distanced protocols. We know organisations that are doing it very successfully and have put in lots of risk mitigation measures, and similarly we know of organisations who have just taken the decision to shut their catering for the foreseeable future and encourage people to bring their own working lunch into the office. Whichever way you decide to go, the foundation of your decision making has to be the risk assessment, and I would suggest you engage with your catering provider in undertaking that risk assessment. Again, lots of really practical suggestions here: implement cashless payment systems, reduce or remove self-service options, have a service counter. Again, lots of catering providers putting up perspex screens between the service counter and their customers. And we're seeing the rise of allocated service times and staggered service provision. So effectively the employee will get an allocated 15-minute slot when they will have to go down to, if they want to, go down to the restaurant and get their food, and then either sit in a socially distanced dining room or return to their desk and eat. Lots of alternatives, lots of workarounds, lots of real creative thinking going on in this sector in terms of the rise of the takeaway service from your workplace dining facility, desk delivery, pre-ordering. Lots of really great ideas where you can work around and ensure that people have a good experience of eating in the workplace. So M&E, the advice is all out there. We would recommend that you speak to your M&E provider and develop a plan of action with them, as they are the people that will understand your infrastructure and what is possible and what's feasible. The top line recommendations are that wherever possible, you stop internal air recirculation. and that you maximise external ventilation wherever possible. So you need to be very mindful of, if you're de-densifying your buildings, that your BMS doesn't override the requirement for as much ventilation as possible. So effectively the advice is that you maximise external ventilation, even if it leads to thermal discomfort. So again, you can see for people coming back into the working environment where you've had to increase external ventilation, that actually the environment may not be optimized as they found it before the lockdown. Very simple one is open doors and open windows, and I know that some buildings you can't do that, but where possible, just keep them open all day, and that even means front doors, so that you're just maximising that through flow of external air. So health and hygiene is just as critical as the social distancing rule, and it's important that employees promote and encourage and provide facilities for staff to maintain good hygiene practices. And it's important that we train people and that we communicate to people and that we reinforce good behaviours. And really here's just a checklist of things that as an organisation you might want to consider. So effective hand washing protocols, the provision of PPE where the risk assessment determines that that's the appropriate thing to do, hand sanitizer throughout the building, and certainly where people move from non-controlled zones into controlled zones, and then between the fixed team zones that you may have created. Provide tissues throughout the building with appropriate waste bins, and define the procedure as well. If somebody becomes symptomatic at work, what you're going to do, and also if somebody becomes symptomatic having recently been at work, what is the process and protocol that you're going to follow. And then we've just put in here, provide ongoing communication and assess the risks on a regular basis. So reoccupying an office is one thing, but then having a team of people that have been in the office for an extended period of time and how behaviours revert to pre-lockdown needs to be monitored so that you can then address those risks. So the risk assessment and the risk monitoring needs to be ongoing, and an organisation needs to have a due process around that. And we'd also recommend that organisations have specific barrier and enhanced cleaning protocols that they can implement as and when needed. So last but not least, on our sort of whirlwind tour of FM considerations of the reoccupation, is possibly the most contentious, and that's breakout spaces and hubs. So spaces that previously were designed to encourage human interactivity, connectivity, networking in the environment. So their complete focus has now changed and disappeared. We've put in some recommendations there. People are talking about having breakout spaces in the open air. They're talking about closing them down completely. And it will depend on how your breakout spaces are structured and how you service them, and that will determine how you approach this. But we would recommend removing furniture that doesn't support social distancing, removing all unnecessary furniture such as incidental tables where they could become cross-contamination risks, taking out crockery and cutlery. I mean, you can just go to the nth degree really in terms of how safe you make them, depending on what the risk is. What of course you need to do is replace that with something. So you can have serviced hubs where you manage the critical control points and you make sure that you provide all the facilities, but actually it's serviced as opposed to self-service. We've even talked about bringing in a controlled tea trolley service, again harking back to the good old days of the 80s and 90s. So you could have a contamination controlled tea trolley that then provides all the services that would have been provided in the hub, but provides them to desks to reduce that unnecessary movement within the office. And just finally, probably is going to be a requirement is to stagger and allocate fixed break times, given some of the allocations to hub points that we know are out there at the moment. So where you have one hub servicing between 80 and 100 people, you are going to have to manage that somehow so that you don't end up with a social distancing risk point. So for my final slide, just a note to the FM teams out there to plan for the future. I think we need to stay agile within our profession. We need to plan for stop and start activities, and we need to stay absolutely flexible to support the changing needs of the core business. But fundamentally, I think the most important thing here is to communicate with our colleagues throughout an organisation to make sure that they understand what's happening, the reasons why we're doing certain things within offices, and to ensure that we manage their anxieties and we keep offices safe for them. Thank you.
There we go. Thank you very much indeed to Ruth. And I agree the idea of a tea trolley, although actually at this point a very large drinks trolley, is a most appealing one. Now, we are going over to hear from Mark Harris now, who's going to be talking today about the importance of and the best ways of debriefing your crisis groups and how to implement the lessons learned, be followed by a short case study on revalidating your plans and seizing opportunities in the new normal. Mark is Blindside's lead crisis consultant, and he's responsible for ensuring Blindside's clients are correctly serviced throughout the crisis and the crisis and issues management cycle, from the identification of risks and issues, the preparation of teams, the prevention through planning and training, to response and eventual recovery. Mark has held senior positions in leading consultancies involved in crisis management and response, such as control risks and crisis communications and issues management with Burston Marstella. Mark is currently working with a number of Blindside's clients as they respond to the issues and challenges of COVID-19, both here in the UK and internationally. Mark will be answering questions live after his presentation, so do upload them. And over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'll just get the presentation up. So this is going to be Blindside's take on what to do this week. So essentially, again, we're talking about resilience. So what we need to do is check how the return to work is going. So are your employees returning to work confident that the measures that you've put in place are keeping them safe and healthy? And again, look to the overall performance of your organisation and ensure that that is going well. And then check what can be done better and how you can improve things. And also, what is the reaction of stakeholders? So you maintain your communications with the stakeholders and get their feedback, both internally and externally, as to how things are going. Then, as Elizabeth mentioned, we'll be talking through debriefing of the teams and looking at the crisis management team and your other working groups, and then also reviewing crisis and issue management bandwidth, which is something that I'll come on to later on, with a view to then social unrest and economic downturn. So debriefing the teams then. You need to look at it through the following phases: your preparedness. So were we ready for this? And in fact, actually, probably if we look across a number of organizations, I don't think anybody was quite ready for the speed with which lockdown took place. Hold on a minute. Sorry, I'll just check that you've getting Sorry, have people got my screens?
Are you sharing your screen, Mark?
I've tried to, but it says the host has disabled my participant screen sharing.
Okay, carry on with your presentation and I will look into that. Can you try it again?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Great. So, as I said, you need to look at it from the preparedness point of view. So, were you prepared? And I don't think anybody really was. Then, how did you actually respond to it? Making sure that you looked at all the lessons learned, that you're getting feedback from people about that. And then the recovery phase, as we start going through this return to the new normal, the transition phase, as we move from lockdown to slightly more relaxed measures and the return to work. And what you should be doing when you're debriefing is covering the following things. So the teamwork, what were the dynamics of the teams? How did it go? And did it all work successfully? Make sure, and we'll highlight this in one of the case studies going on, that you get individual reflections. So a one-to-one with people on those teams. How did it go? Was it too dictatorial, or was there good discussions but few decisions? Also check on your communications. Did you get the right messaging out there? Was it received correctly? Did people understand? And were you using the right platforms? And all of that comes back with your employee feedback. Ensure that throughout the organization, you are hearing what your employees feel about what you have done. And then capture the lessons learned. And this is extremely important. And those of you who have been on this series of webinars since they started, and I think we're on the 12th now, it is something that I've always talked about. And it is incredibly important that you capture the lessons of what went well and that you incorporate them back into your plans to make sure that you are improved for the future. And then review and implement the changes to those plans and teams. Were there people that you should have had on the team, but you didn't necessarily have them there right from the get-go? So, crisis management then within a crisis. How does COVID-19 compare with other crises and issues? Well, I like to look at this and talk to clients about it. With my experience of crises, they have normally had a finite time. If we look at something like a kidnap, we know roughly how long it is going to take for the successful resolution of that issue. But more importantly, we will see that it is kept amongst a small number of people. And that small number of people will be dealing with the issue and then settle into a routine, and they can then return to work. If we look at other things like extortions, it's similar to that. If we look at product recalls, again, there can be a finite time to it, and there may well be longer time to actually then look at your reputation after you have produced, you had to conduct the product recall. But in time, it will be finished. But with COVID-19, you have a totality to it that encompasses everybody. All of your stakeholders have been impacted by this. The duration, we don't know when this is going to finish. And also you are looking at global and regional variations in the response. We are not in lockstep as we respond and then as we come out of our lockdown and we relax measures. So you need to think then about what else could happen within the current issue or crisis of COVID-19 that you're dealing with. So reputational issues then, from the point of view of someone like Dyson, as we've seen in the last 3 weeks, with their back to work plan. Also, you're looking at heightened sensitivities now on global issues, such as Black Lives Matter. And then with the forecast by the OECD that the United Kingdom is going to have the worst recession in Europe. And also Professor Clifford Stott talking about the possibility of community frustration and anger due to rising unemployment, job losses, racial and economic inequality. And all of this coming through with criminal activity and local breakdown of law and order, leading perhaps potentially to riots and disorder. Also there with the gym shot, let's think about some of the reputational issues there and the heightened sensitivities on global issues. On the back of Black Lives Matter, we'll have seen that the CrossFit CEO, Greg Glassman, he came unstuck on the Twitter sphere following the murder or the death of George Floyd. And also a gym apparel company, one of their designers, a black gentleman, he chose to do a LinkedIn post about the issues and Black Lives Matter. However, what was interesting about that was immediately a number of people started in on that company about how many black people they were actually employing, and for those from other minor ethnic groups. So it created an issue for the company rather than showing some form of support for the overall cause. Again then, so are you prepared and focused for what might be coming next? And again, we are in an uncertain period, and it's not, as I said, going to end soon. And so decision-making under radical uncertainty that we have at the moment is both a different and challenging skill for most management teams. It's got to be based then on the principles of good crisis management. So that is having a process for the defining of the issues and setting clear overriding objectives that are understood by all, and everybody is empowered to deliver on those objectives. And then doing the contingency planning on a few options so that that informs your organization so they're able to conduct rapid changes in direction if needed. And then, of course, communications, establishing the consistent messaging and communicating these with all of your stakeholders, as I said, both internal, such as your employees, and then external, supply chain and customers and distribution if required. And maintain that engagement, keep it going. And also, going back to the lessons learned, always learn throughout so that you are better prepared for the future as you go forwards. And hopefully that'll help make some sense then of what our case studies are about as we go forward. So the scenario planning then, this was a client, and the client was an infrastructure investor based in the UK with employees, offices and projects in Asia and Africa. Now, their primary objective was to ensure that the organisation had a comprehensive approach to resilience in the face of COVID-19 throughout the organisation. And these scenarios then that we helped them with were based on very simple scenarios, not so perhaps the complicated ones that you might use for your overall strategic planning. But it was, if there was an increase in COVID-19 cases among staff, what stage then would the medical facilities become overwhelmed? And what would they then do in a contingency planning mode to manage that? They also looked then, again, at the illness among business critical employees. What happens if the chief finance officer is ill? Who has sign-off? Who can help make sure that processes continue? And also, because of their business, they were concerned about taking COVID-19 into project areas which were clean or didn't have any cases. How would they then be seen? And what would their communications and their interaction with the communities within those projects be? Going through those scenarios helped them to ensure that they were better prepared should any of those situations occur. And then looking at the facilitated debrief, something that I mentioned earlier on. So this is a client, they're an extractive industry with their head office in London in the UK and assets in West Africa. The CEO contacted Blindside to ask for assistance with both mentoring and guiding the crisis management team and also the incident management team on site, which of course we agreed to do. But partaking in those sessions, it very quickly became obvious to us that the issue was a disconnect between the head office and the executive committee and the crisis management team there, and then looking at what the assets had actually done. So it was down to a lack of communication. It was down to the bandwidth of the executives and senior managers and supervisors who were getting on with their day job, but then also looking at the impact of COVID-19. And of course, conducting all of that led to fatigue and people not taking holiday. And in addition, those on this site had been there for a very, very long time. So what we then did is we participated, as I said, in those sessions, and we discussed the initial findings with the Chief Executive Officer and the Chief Operations Officer, and then set up one-to-one sessions with key executives and managers on both the crisis management team and the incident management team to get their feedback as to what they thought the issues might be. Now, what the recommendations were was that they had to go through again the statement of their intent. What is the overall objective of the organisation, and make sure that was communicated to all internal and external stakeholders. Then look at the role of the employees in delivering the intent and empowering those employees to do it collectively. Also, the crisis management team should be more supportive to the incident management team and the asset, rather than demanding, have you done this, have you done that? But once they had seen what the incident management team and the asset had actually put in place, that became a moot point. And of course, reviewing the communication channels and platforms and ensuring that was better. And in order to help with individuals on site, we were able to help the client engage with a psychologist specializing in post-crisis and involuntary isolation counseling to assist them on other measures to help with mental health and well-being. So drawing to a close then, get the debriefs done, please, to ensure that you are ready for the better normal and that you are prepared for obstacles that may well threaten or impede your progress. So going back to that agility, keep the communications going in this transitional period. Ensure lessons are learnt and that you incorporate those into the better organisations from the new normal. So what you've collected during the session and of course then through the debriefs. And please, if it will help, do please contact me on email or call me to arrange a checkup consultation for free on a pressing issue so that you can check your wing mirrors and make sure that you are going in the right direction and nothing is going to blindside you. Thank you. Back to you, Elizabeth.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed, Mark. And I've got a couple of questions that have come in for you. There seems to be very little coordination between HR and our crisis management team, which is causing us problems. What are your thoughts?
That's not good, is my initial thought.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's extremely important that HR is, one, part of the crisis management team. And secondly, I think in something like this, which is a public health crisis, which is impacting all elements of a business or an entity, then it is fundamental that HR is there and that HR has a very, very large say in what that company is doing.
Okay, and in regard to COVID-19 staff communication, do you feel that daily updates are over the top? And also, what are the key issues we should be updating employees on?
It's not a very easy question to answer immediately, but it depends on what frequency of communications you've established. If you have established a daily update, then I would review whether that daily update is still required and then ensure that communicate why you may well be moving perhaps from a daily update through to a every second day or twice a week update point of view. Once you set up a set schedule, if that schedule stops, people then become concerned because there is a silence and they want to know what is happening. Mm. I think the most important thing that you should be communicating is the efforts that you are conducting to make sure that you are organised and better prepared for a return, not to the normal, but for an emergence into the new normal. Mm. And that you are doing everything possible to reassure your employees realistically and transparently about what those measures are, what it means to those employees, and what the future is going to look like as you transition out of lockdown through the relaxations and the return to work and operations.
Okay, and I think we've got time for one more before we go over to the legal section. Do employers need to be planning now for a possible second peak of the virus?
Yes, very much so. I think it's extremely important that people are prepared for that. And I think it goes back to when I was talking about the other issues that may well be out there. There is the possibility of a second wave, and also that second wave may well be localized. So you need to look at your operations, where they are, and then have workarounds and contingency planning for perhaps you may well have a plant in the northeast. And if the northeast has a regional lockdown, where else then do we source those elements that we need from that production plant in the northeast? How do we still maintain our operations with a localized or regionalized lockdown?
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much indeed, as ever, for joining us, Mark. It's been a pleasure. And as you heard, Mark's details are there if any of you would like to get in touch with him. And now I'm going to ask Darren Smith to join us. Darren is an employment partner with Harrington Carmichael. Hi there, how are you?
Good, thank you. Good morning / afternoon almost.
Good day, everybody. Absolutely. We have, as usual, we have a load of legal questions for you, and panelists and attendees, don't forget you can actually put your hands up to ask questions as well. Oh, I did say that this one might not come up, and looking at what's going to be happening tomorrow and what the implications might be for employers. Just generally speaking, what are your feelings that on what might be the case in terms of that announcement?
Well, firstly, the announcement's bound not to be until well into the evening. Mm-hmm. The government loves to send forward the updates after hours, usually on a Friday evening. We know the outline. We know that we've got the flexible furlough scheme coming in from July the 1st, which is going to be useful for many, many employers. Many employers who were wondering about whether to bring forward or to start thinking about redundancy planning will now be able to utilise the furlough scheme until the end of October on a flexible system. So even when they're only able to support employees for 1, 2, 3, 4 days a week, whatever it might be, the other days can be furloughed, provided, of course, that they've already been furloughed so that they're eligible. The only details we're expecting tomorrow is it's the mechanism of how the claim would work. We know the outlines, we're just looking at the detail. I suppose there may be some restrictions that we're not expecting, but hopefully not too many, if any. But otherwise, other than some outline facts, we just don't know what's coming tomorrow, other than it's going to provide us with the detail that we need, that business needs, in order to make use of the flexible furlough scheme from the 1st of July.
Okay, thank you. What are the mechanisms that employers should be thinking about putting into place now, particularly with regards to employees who are indicating that they are not comfortable with a return to work?
Well, I mean, what I say always in this sort of a situation is to speak with the individuals. I'm sure by this point employers would have done all of the legal requirements, but also the best practice requirements in terms of ensuring that they have a safe working environment. The question, by the way, is based on the premise of a return, I think, to the workplace, as opposed to those coming off a furlough but perhaps working remotely. So talking about the actual workplace, hopefully the employers would have done as much as they can to make it a safe environment. If employees, though, are invited, or I suppose rather instructed, to return in some way, and we hear from the employees that there are ongoing concerns, we need to speak with those individuals. We need to speak with our health and safety representatives. We need to ensure that those concerns are dealt with. This is going to be a longer term issue, because clearly if employees don't feel confident to return, then they're either not going to, which will bring problems, or if they do, they're going to be in constant fear, which is of course not what we can have in the workplace. I think if listeners were listening to one of the other webinars that I was on, I went into it in more detail. But I think talk to them, understand their concerns, and you should be able to resolve them I think, if you listen and people are acting reasonably.
Okay, you touched there on the fact that quite a few employees will now be looking to work from home. We've had a couple of questions about how that will impact policy, particularly if previously employees have asked for flexible working and have now proven that actually it does work. What would your advice be there for employers?
Well, it's a really good question because, of course, it's quite common, isn't it, before this COVID environment that we live in, to say no to many flexible working requests, certainly in their entirety. And suddenly that's being challenged because for many businesses in lots of sectors, we've seen that home working seems to be going just fine. So if you are an employer that still would prefer to resist applications to move more to a home working workforce, the legal requirements are still the same. You have the same 8 reasons following a flexible working request to use. And I think that employment tribunals are not likely to get too involved with a business decision if a business decides for itself that it would be unable to agree an application. But of course, it may well be harder for us to justify and harder for us to persuade the employee as well that what we're saying is right. And so perhaps one of the ways forward would be if business isn't satisfied by what's been happening recently, to offer some trial periods. So when everybody else returns, if we can think of it returning to normal, applications come in for flexible working, and employers still think that there are good reasons to say no, they can. Obviously, there's a set process. But perhaps instead we could offer trial periods to ascertain whether or not on a long-term basis it does work to work remotely or not.
Okay. And you touched there on the subject of employment tribunals. There have been quite a few questions today and in the last few webinars that we've looked at on what the specific challenges are posed by COVID to employment tribunals. Are they still going ahead? Are there things that employers need to be thinking about in terms of their own either ongoing or upcoming tribunals? How are they being managed under social distancing?
Well, any employer that's got an existing employment tribunal claim, I'm sure knows, because they've been informed by the tribunal what's happening to their particular case. On a rough basis, what's been happening is for the last couple of months, employment tribunal hearings have not been going ahead. And instead, what would have been the first day of a listed hearing was converted to a telephone preliminary hearing. So that would be to discuss how the case is going to be managed going forward. For most of the clients I'm working with, that simply meant let's postpone it and work out a date that we can all do in the future. But I'm aware of cases that had been waiting for 1.5 years that were due to be held this month that have now been put back till September 2021. And of course, I'm afraid there's going to be an even bigger backlog than there was before. The president of the employment tribunals has recently issued new guidance to say that the employment tribunal system is working its way to go back to normal. Very shortly, they've got a video conferencing system that they're going to start using. So we are seeing a return, but inevitably there are going to be delays. And I think I should add at this point that I do fear that employers are going to face, I expect, a high number of employment tribunal claims, because I think many people are desperate. There's lots of people that have been furloughed and are grateful, and perhaps they can go back to work after furlough. But for all the good news, we know that there's been lots of sad news in relation to redundancies and restructures. And I think if you're an employee that has been made redundant and has no income and is struggling to find another job, you are far more likely in that desperate state to seek to bring an employment tribunal claim. So I'm afraid that I do see a spike coming in the number of claims that business face.
And are there sort of specific measures or steps that employers could take at the moment to try and mitigate against that?
Well, there are. I mean, obviously, you're going to expect me to say that individual businesses should take individual advice, but I mean, the basics would be, of course, to ensure that you get the redundancy process spot on. Mm-hmm. It's always the case that it's easy to make mistakes. So to be guided by or to work alongside a legal advisor would be, I think, the right thing to do, because this isn't usually affecting one or two people. Usually, if businesses are going through redundancies, it's affecting tens or hundreds, and in some cases, thousands of individuals. So it's important to get it right. So that's obviously one thing, but there are other things to consider. So, for example, one of the options that business has during a redundancy process is to take advantage of the furlough scheme. So I have clients that are otherwise saying you would have been made redundant at the end of this month or next month, and it's your choice, but we're willing to keep you on the books, as it were, mm-hmm. for you to remain on the furlough scheme, and the employer will face that there is some cost from August the 1st onwards, but some employers are saying, one of our responsibilities in law is to mitigate the effects of a redundancy. And I'm quite sure that employees will be arguing that one of those ways that you can mitigate it is to allow me to stay on the furlough scheme. So there are other things to consider, but I would take individual advice.
Okay. And probably better be our last question. We seem to take an awful lot of your time up. Thank you. We have informal working practices, i.e. staff can normally choose to work from home, and before COVID-19 it was 1 or 2 days at most. Now staff may choose to work for up to 4 days from home regularly. Should we encourage permanent changes to terms to allow this, or can we carry on informally and pick it up on a case-by-case basis where this may cause productivity, lack of communication issues, etc.?
Well, I think it depends on what the business wants. So the end of that question says to me that the business is wanting to protect itself in case it needs to bring people back to the office in case productivity falls, in which case you would want to be avoiding changing the permanent or normal place of work. Because, of course, if you change the normal place of work to a home location, then it's going to make it a lot more complicated to get that employee back into the office. Next point is, if you don't have a policy on this and you deal with it informally, yes, that works for a while, but of course the risk is that the longer that person works from home, the more likely it is that they will argue that that has become a contractual right through custom and practice. So then if, say, in 2 years' time, the employer says, actually, it's not working anymore, come back into the office, please, some employees will do that. And others will say, well, no, I don't want to. They'll go and speak to a legal advisor who will say, well, you've got an argument that your normal place of work has changed. So where we want to maintain protections for us, the employer, I would have it down in a set policy and make it very clear, and you need to repeat this message often, that the ability to work from home is informal, it's discretionary, it's not contractual, and it can be changed, amended, or removed at any point.
Thank you. Thank you for making that so clear. Good, and I think that's all we have time for today. Next week we will hopefully bring you an analysis of tomorrow's announcement, plus more expert speakers, and you can register now free of charge for that. And there will be details of our other legal webinars which will follow in a moment. And in the meantime, thank you for your attention. Thank you for bearing with us earlier on, and we hope you have a peaceful week and see you next Thursday. Thank you.